Hi, folks. Welcome back to another EDGEy conversation. It's Zoe here. We have our staff team with us today, which is always a great way for us to start the week. And we're excited to be talking a little bit about abundance. So what is abundance was sort of the big question coming in today, and really thinking about that sitting alongside or perhaps in opposition to scarcity. So an exciting thing for us to explore in this particular moment. In history, in our cultural context, in our church context. So yeah, our first kind of question to think about, team, is what does abundance mean for you? When you hear that word, what comes up? How do you really think about abundance?
Yeah, abundance is such an interesting concept. I think at first glance, I always think of like having way too much, having like more than you need, a surplus of some sort. But then I realized that surplus and abundance are not the same word for a reason. I think, when looking a little bit deeper, what I found is that abundance is really related to having enough with comfort. So it's like, you have enough food with comfort. It's about having enough, enough of, well, I don't know, whatever it is. But with comfort or ease, it brings me to I believe it's the Exodus story, where folks are being given like a loaf of bread once a day, and then they're given 2 loaves of bread on Saturday or Friday, I can't remember which, so that like the following day there is a loaf available for them for their Sabbath. But then, if you tried to hoard the loaves in between, you would end up having rotten loaves that would stink and would really give you this impression that you're not supposed to take more than just enough. And so I think that that's really countercultural in the society that we find ourselves in, because we're kind of on this, in economics, they call it the hedonic treadmill. It's this idea that you get from one goal, and as soon as you achieve that goal, your goal is already gone to the next thing. And so it's always about this incremental progress on a like kind of growth trajectory of something in your life. But the Bible is just really reminding us that enough with comfort, or however you want to define it, really is that sense of abundance. It's being able to be in community and together and have that together. So that's kind of my thoughts on that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Alexandra. I think you cued for me a couple of things that I've really been working through around abundance. And it's like trying to separate like what do we need versus what do we want? And so really feeling like abundance is sitting in this place of like, do I have the things that I need? And does everyone around me also have the things that they need? So kind of helping me shift from this like place of what do I want or individuality into this place of like community, and like, does everyone have all the things that they need, myself included? And how does that maybe support us in being stronger or more connected? So that's been something I've been working through a lot around thinking about abundance, particularly like in a community, like in a community mindset.
I love I love the reference to the manna story and the Exodus, because I think that is for me the biblical story that is the antidote to scarcity. Right? They're escaping from 400 years of slavery because Pharaoh had a dream that there wasn't going to be enough. So they built big barns and tried to get everything. And they got the grain, and then they got the cattle, and then they got the land, and then they got the people. And that's how that's how Israel ended up in slavery in Egypt. It's an interesting note on Joseph's story, by the way, because it was Joseph that interpreted the dream for Pharaoh and started this whole thing. But in the end, this tiny community of abundance, the Israelites, wins, right? And in fact, it was so threatening to Pharaoh that he finally said, go, get out of here. And then he had second thoughts and chased them. Anyway, you know the story. So for me, that, and I agree with Alexandra too, I think abundance in my mind is enough. I don't know if my psyche is always completely there, especially when it comes to ice cream. But anyway, but it is that. But the Mana story points out that sense of enough, our internal sense of enough, has to do with trust, has to do with connection, and it has to do with trust. So I like your reference, Zoe, to community. And I often say with EDGE, right, if we feel like we don't have enough time, enough capacity, enough money, enough whatever, we just haven't found the right partner yet. We just haven't built the right relationship. And I experienced it over and over, like in the same moment, right? In the same, from one moment to the next, I can go from scarcity to abundance just by opening to a conversation with people who, well, we were in a meeting with Piwa the other time, and he just said, whenever I gather with you EDGE folks, the spirit is a palpable presence. And all of my scarcity thinking about retirement suddenly turns to abundance. Just in a moment. Anyway, loving your haircut, Tom.
Thanks, Rob. I don't have an abundance of hair, as you can see. There's some scarcity going on there. What are you gonna do? What are you gonna do? Well, you know me. I mean, I find the conversation fascinating right out of the gate. But when I put on my lens of technology, abundance and scarcity start to have some artificial meaning to them. In a world where you have, for example, a digital economy, or you have you're talking about information, or you're talking about data. How can you have anything but, like, there's nothing that needs to be created. You're not going to run out of resources. You don't have those same kind of physical constraints on what might create the creation of value or the creation of goods. And so it's a slight shift in the conversation, but in some ways it's useful because scarcity is almost a necessity. Certainly if you're considering any kind of model of economics, you have to have scarcity in order for economics to even make any sense whatsoever. And so when we look in the digital world and we look at virtual worlds, we look at virtual economies, we look at cryptocurrency, all of these things create their own kind of artificial sense of scarcity in order to be able to actually function. And so we're in a completely manufactured world where abundance should be kind of the only thing that's happening. You also run into this sort of the human need to have that scarcity, to put things, to be able to assign value. And I wonder how that translates now back into the real world, where there are real things that are backing what we consider, abundant or scarce, and resources and so forth. How does that thinking translate? How much can we take ownership of the scarcity that exists and say, this is manufactured scarcity, and examine those areas where we're doing that? And we don't have to do that. We shouldn't do that.
Tom, as you were speaking, it was making me think of the way that we look at time. And, like with a lot of projects, or with the way that we've kind of commodified time into, like, let's say that your time is scarce, and therefore I have a maximum of like 10 seconds or 5 seconds to grab you in a TikTok, in a video, in a hook sentence, in something to get your attention. And then after that, if that wasn't successful, then the person maybe moves on really quickly. And just that sort of like sense that there's so much out there that I can consume, that the time and space that's provided to actually consume things well and digest them and go deeper into ourselves and into our thoughts, and like move a little bit out of that more superficial kind of reactionary space, means that like we've really programmed ourselves into this like sense of mass scarcity. And I'm also thinking a little bit about like I have ADHD, and so thinking about the way in which like I can do a project where if time is abundant, then it's much harder for that sort of attention and that focus to come on until like there's a crunch to say like, no, time is not abundant. You have a certain period of time to be able to accomplish something. You must do it. That's it. And so it's interesting how these different like perceptions of time, or thinking of death with people and saying, like I have lots of time to like cultivate and hold on to this relationship, or build it in some way with parents or grandparents or whomever it may be. And then something happens and that changes, or that sense of scarcity really becomes very present and a very dominant force in our mind. And so it's really interesting how this sense of abundance, being something that we don't fully understand, becomes such like an important place to meditate on it, so that we can start to understand what are these spaces of enoughness, of abundance in our life, and how can we cultivate a mindset of abundance, so that all of these perceptions of time, of attention, of superficiality or deepness, or all of these things where abundance is pervasive in our life, we can now start to ground ourselves a little bit more.
Yeah, I think like Alexandra, that's I think such a distinct point about this experience of scarcity, or this experience of abundance, particularly I think at a broader cultural level, about like how are we experiencing time and space, and how does it show up then? How do we behave ourselves? How do we behave in connection to others when we have those kind of mindsets? And I think you've kind of nicely pointed to this other place that I'm wondering about. Then I'm like, what does abundance look like? Or where are you experiencing abundance? Because I think maybe we don't have a good grasp on even knowing when we're in a moment of abundance. Like we've got a good sense of what scarcity looks like, or that graspy feeling of like, things are scarce, I must hold so tight. So like, what does abundance look like? How do we know when we're in an abundant moment?
Great question, Zoe. I'm first of all aware that I respond to that question from a place of profound, deep privilege. And so some of the comments that I make are shaped by that experience. Because I want to say that some of the most abundant times in my life, meaning rich and full of life and meaning and purpose and energy, were times that I might have described as scarcity, times of scarcity. That there's almost an inverse relation. Like when our third son was born, talk about time, from day 1 to day 10, we didn't know if he'd make the next day. Because his lungs were not fully developed enough yet. So it was a race against time in terms of how much oxygen they could give him and whether they would develop in time to actually take over. And yet that time, I have this sense of total abundance and blessing, because I became so clear that I would give my life in exchange right now, right? And I felt blessed because I knew I'd been given something so precious that I would do that. No hesitation, no, sense of, oh, I have to give up, sacrifice at all. It would be like a joy almost to do it. When I was going through school for preparation for ministry, like we had 2 kids. When he had the second kid, we couldn't actually afford to stay in an apartment. So we moved back to my mom and dad's. Never had money from one day to the next, and never worried about it a second. We didn't have it. And the more I got a car first, and then we got, an apartment, then a house. And the more we started savings, the more I worried about money. And I've often talked in sermons and so on about, that's for me is the meaning of tithing. It's a reminder that God blesses us so that we can give back to God, and God gathers it up. And we often end it there, right? 10%. I give you, make it prosperous, you give it 10% back. It's like a transaction. But no, God wants it back so that God can hold this feast where everyone has enough. That's the abundance. It's like this back and forth. It's not about a percentage. It's this reminder that life is in the exchange. Life comes to us on the way to someone else. It's not about an amount. It's about trusting in a connect, trusting in a relationship, engaging in that. And again, just remember, I've not experienced a hopeless hunger. So I don't know what that looks like from that perspective. But I know that if we all can trust that, then maybe we've got our best chance against anyone having that hunger, even the widow and the orphan and the foreigner, which are the three categories that are named in that. That's why you give a tithe, so that the feast can happen. Everybody has enough. Enough.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I really just wanted to respond to that very same sentiment. And I think you pretty much summarized what I wanted to say, Rob. But it's true. As I'm questing myself and trying to consider how can I change my life to do more meaningful things than I have in the past. And the biggest hang up is often that notion of, well, how do we maintain our standard of living? How do we keep it? And I'm starting to become convinced of what you just said, that you almost have to embrace having less to realize just how much you actually have, and how or maybe how little you actually need of the material world in order to be truly happy and be an agent for good in your world. And it's, in some regards, it's a little unfortunate that you have to kind of give up in order to be able to do more good. But on the other hand, that's kind of built in. I think that's kind of built into that model, is you get caught up in the world of material things. And when we talk about abundance, I think many of us will go straight to goods, right? Stuff, as opposed to abundance of love and things like that, which are, of course, renewable resources. But I think we have to sort of figure out how can we be comfortable divesting ourselves of those things. I'm reading a great book, which probably came out of one of your recommendations, which of course is now backwards because I'm mirroring. It's The Sandbox Revolution: Raising Kids for a Just World. And there's a bunch of short passages, and one is from an Indigenous woman, and who's a medicine woman and has learned to sort of cultivate within her very limited amount of resources, find where the medicinal herbs and flowers are, and to learn how to bring those back to the people. And the stories that I'm hearing as I educate myself a little bit on Indigenous lifestyle is deeply rooted in the sense of abundance, and we think about peoples who've been displaced and marginalized and oppressed and stolen from, and yet they still, to this day, consider themselves as rich and abundant, and their culture is deep and vast and meaningful. And I think that those are some examples that I want to continue learning from and educating myself about, because I find that deeply hopeful, deeply hope-inspiring.
Thank you, Tom. I think that the conversation the examples that both of you just shared, Tom and Rob, just really sparked something in me around the responsibility around abundance. That abundance is a communally owned thing. It's always in relation to something else or the other, or another person, part of the world. But if you're going to forage for something, the rule of foraging is that you take enough for yourself, but you leave enough for the plant to be able to propagate. I always think about that with common foraging spots, that if somebody takes a third and then the next person takes a third and the next person takes a third of what's left, then what is actually left at the end of the day? It's kind of a question of what is actually needed for things to renew. And also just thinking about like how how much of a responsibility, I guess, that we have to cultivating that abundance and cultivating that culture of abundance. And I think that I don't know, there's something around this responsibility. It's an incomplete thought, so I'm going to take a pause.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Alexandra. I think and again, I find these conversations so helpful because everyone's framing offers a little piece that helps pull it all together for me. But I'm thinking about this sentiment of Ubuntu, like I am me because of you and you are you because of me, and this kind of shared experience of humanity. And that piece you said about abundance only exists in relationship with, if I am me completely isolated without anyone around me, then abundance doesn't thrive here. It doesn't exist here. It's only possible through relationship to other things, or in relationship with other things, that it has an opportunity to be nurtured or to thrive in this setting. And so I think that's an interesting place for me to have to really sit and think about what that means. And I hear it too in this context of I think in EDGE, sometimes we've had this conversation of the spirit is present when there are two or more people in the room. And so thinking about that as well as part of our journey of abundance, and how we pull those things together as part of our spiritual journey. And then I think this other piece for me, again, I love these conversations because they never go the way I think that they're going to go. Because then I had this question of okay, so how do we shift from scarcity into abundance? But I think that's the wrong question because I'm hearing this inverse relationship of there is something so necessary about scarcity in order to help us into abundance. And so I'm not sure that we can ever, can we divest ourselves from scarcity? Or is there a linking or a connection that has to live there or exist? I'm not sure. You can help me flesh it out. But I'm that question no longer resonates for me. So I'll leave that on the table for folks to try and think through.
That's a very interesting thought, Zoe. And Alexandra reminded me of something I heard on the weekend that ties right into this. But this notion of, you need scarcity in order to have abundance. Maybe we reframe that. It's a contrasting thing. You need to have experience of scarcity to be able to understand the abundance, to see the contrast and to understand that. I think that is what is resonating in all the stories that we've heard with what Rob shared and what I've shared and so forth. And so I think you have to kind of discover where is abundance hiding? And I think what Alexandra suggested rings true for me, is that abundance is hiding in the groups, in the community. It is not something that one person can say, I have abundance. It's something that's truly starts to emerge when you start to talk about the collective. And the story that I heard on CBC was of an Inuk man describing his first hunt. And I think he was hunting caribou as a young man, sort of a rite of passage. And that once he had successfully killed his first caribou, the tradition of the group, of the community, was that you don't take the meat for yourself. You bring it and you feed your grandmother, you feed your sister, you feed the community members first. And then if there's something left over, you take that. And it's from the very first get-go, you are taught that the moment you come into abundance, because you just killed a large animal, you have a responsibility now to share that. And to have that deeply built into a very, very important rite of passage and a ritual that is maintained as a tradition, those values are embedded within the community. That's where the abundance is to be shared and discovered and found. A thought.
Yeah, this is a great question again, and I love the abandoning of the question. It's leading me in all kinds of places. Number one, I remember it was probably in seminary that one of the things that Luther said was the purpose of the law is not that we follow it, but to show us we can't. And so it drives us into the arms of God. It's kind of like this business of scarcity being necessary, right? It's like you've got to have a suck for a blow. Sorry, explaining. I mean, a low pressure area for wind to happen, right? It's like the lack draws the abundance, right? And it's another way of saying it is in the relationship, or life is in the exchange, right? It's not in the having, it's in the exchange. You can have it all, and if it's not in relationships, it means nothing, right? But it's, in every spiritual tradition, there's this idea of, either the secret or the trickster, or like, what are you doing, God? What is with this law? We can't do it. Yeah, I know. Just, you can picture God, but, and so, it's made me rethink some things. Like, it's not the gross national product, for example, it's the velocity of money then that matters. You see, if life's in the exchange, it's the velocity of money that matters, not the amount of capital, but how quickly it changes hands. So it makes things like investment more than speculation, right? And it's supposed to be, right? It's because you can't hold on to it. Even if, we retain this sense of ownership, but even so, it's better to have it moving and in exchange and supporting things. And creating life. Abundance is in the velocity of money. No, that's not my final comment. Oh no, it's going to be my final comment.
Yeah, I think all of this is making me think about kind of cross-cultural experiences, whether they're, like wherever you grew up and, 30 kilometers down the road, and the different experiences that someone had there, whether it's, being in one place and then being in another place. It could even be experience between, going over to your friend's house for dinner, and having like a different cultural experience of what's valued and what tools you have at the table and all of these sorts of things. But it's just really making me think about this time in a few times in my life, I guess, where I've like had these sorts of experiences where you're putting yourself in a different situation where the value system is appended as compared with what my value system is, or what I thought was important. And really like being challenged. And I completely understand the privilege in that experience as well. And so there are lots of different ways in which you can have these in local spaces and in relationship with others in your community, and then also in further distances. But when you notice, what other people are valuing and what other people are bringing to the table, I'm going to keep the kitchen analogy going, then you really start to think about what is the actual root of what that value was, or like, am I paying attention to the right things in order to seek out, or abundance, or to pay attention to the scarcity, or what have you? Is it that particular thing is necessary in my life as like a good, or is it that there is or emotions or feelings or relationships, or are there other things that have kind of shaped that? I think that our communal experience as a society and across the world of the COVID pandemic, and the way that we've, at least in North America, in many spaces, where you've had lockdowns and you've had moments where your whole community and your life infrastructure has changed. Maybe there was job loss, maybe there was issues with housing security, whatever it ended up being. There was a shift around how we relate to other people. And I think a lot of people ended up thinking a lot about their value system and what it is that they are spending their most precious commodity, which is their maybe it's not the most precious commodity, but time, how people are spending their time in the world. They're, if someone was commuting 2 hours a day, like now they're not commuting at all, they're working from home, and that's made a huge impact on their family life, and so it's like, oh wait, I'm reminded that like this other aspect of my life is actually like holds such a strong value to me that I don't want to go back to that commute. Or like, now it's kind of making these realizations when you're jostled out of your system to really reevaluate and say like, hey, okay, actually, no, I've been paying attention to the wrong things. I've been paying attention and attributing value to a lot of things in life and paying attention to whether or not I feel this sense of abundance or scarcity in relation to them, when really that should kind of be over here, or maybe I should like shift my focal point a little bit. And again, like really acknowledging that it does take time, space, and energy and mental effort to be able to like go through these sorts of processes, and that's not accessible to everybody. But yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much for that, Alexandra. And again, I think you helped me come into kind of my last like place of wondering or curiosity today. And again, it's shifted so radically from how I thought this conversation was going to go this morning. But I think my new sort of place, and I don't have an answer for it, is around like how do we make space then for abundance with scarcity and all that means in that particular relationship together and in between us. Like how do we make space for abundance to be present? And I think that's like, I think more broadly, that's also a question of like, how do we make space for justice? Because I think those things, that's what I'm hearing, is these things are tied, that if abundance is for all of us and it needs to be something that's about common good, about equity, about equality, like how do we start making space for abundance to be present in our lives? And I think this, like, for me, it's this piece about relationship, as it often is when I'm in these conversations. It's about like, how am I making space to be relationship first with people? Like, how am I building these relationships that have trust embedded in them, that have a sense of like us together as a team moving towards something? And how do I make that really conscious, I think? Like, how do I prioritize that relationship piece as the thing that will move us into abundance versus like, I think I said it in a meeting last week too, like instead of coming into a meeting and starting with like, what's the business? What do we need to accomplish? How much money are we making? How are we investing? It's this question of like, how are we coming into relating to one another? How are we coming into connection and knowing that abundance will beget abundance in lots of different ways if we make space for it to start within this relational place.
Yeah, that's taking me to a kind of a practical place, like a practice place. And one of the practices, so when I'm fearful, in a condition of fear, it's because I'm looking too much to myself. And a great antidote is to take my focus to someone else. So, and I just remember, like, just at a very simple, it was kind of trivial in a way, but it wasn't, talking to a spiritual mentor who, I don't even know what the issue was, but I was in a flap about something, and he just says, Rob, where are you? I'm in the kitchen. Or I'm at home. He says, what room? I said, in the kitchen. He says, are there dishes in the sink? I said, yeah. He says, do them. And he hangs up. So like, if I'm caught in that space of scarcity, which is rooted in fear, right? The fear of scarcity, and it's often not really scarcity, it's a fear of scarcity, right? Make yourself useful. Find some scarcity and help, right? Just do something useful. And that takes me out of that, what can be a self-fulfilling prophecy, the cycling self-absorption, whatever selfishness. So that for me is like a practice around how to make that shift, because it is internal. It's a perception. It's a faith trust thing. Yeah, and you can build relationships by being useful. Hasn't that been Edge's, like, follow the energy and try to be helpful? That's our whole strategy.
Yeah, I think that's a really great practice, and one I think I should actually write down. I think with what you were talking about around social justice and equity, it just kind of really rings true around, like, what is the opportunity cost, in a way, of not paying attention to whether or not other people have access to abundance, or an abundance mindset, or whether like, if we dominate with such a scarcity mindset and we don't find balance, not that these are a dichotomy, but like, if they are a full dichotomy, like, how are we finding balance, and also ensuring that that's happening within an equitable space. Yeah, it's really kind of like blowing my mind open. I often think about this fact that, living where we live and doing the things that we do, we're like in the top 5% of wealth in the world. And we don't see it because we go outside and we're like, oh, well, I have an apartment or a house, and like, I live this, and you're always playing the comparison game with what's around you, whether we want to or not. And just trying to put that in perspective, to be like, you know what? I had the ability to spend time playing in my head today and thinking about all of these wonderful concepts of abundance and scarcity. And I didn't have to focus on, finding a safe place to be, or finding, food or water, or just the basic necessities of life. And I know that's an extreme example, but like, that's also present in our society here as well. So that it's interesting to think about, what sort of, what's possible if we really, at the heart of it, we're kind of thinking about like societal decisions and culture shift and policy with this idea of abundance, and being able to say, well, I have enough money for the papal visit, as Zoe was mentioning earlier, in this one particular context, but I don't have enough money for this other truth and reconciliation activity. So how are we really finding a value and abundance and enoughness and in relationship with one another, so that the relationship is being cultivated in the ways that are most important? I'll pass it over.
I don't think I could have brought us to close in a nicer way, Alexandra. I think you really kind of brought it together around this piece of like, how do we do all of this in relationship, and how does this become part of our way of coexisting, of living together, of sharing time and space. So I'm grateful for everyone's working through some of this around abundance. I think we've maybe like started the can of worms, and I think there's a lot more to be said and talked about, but I'm grateful for everyone's insight and sharing today to help frame what I think is a much bigger conversation within our communities, within our churches, and within our society at large, about how are we moving towards responsibility in our abundant spaces. So thanks so much, everyone, for your time and energy today. It is appreciated as always. And we will see you folks back here next Monday for another EDGEy conversation.